and tell you a little bit about the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group, but I just want to welcome you and make you feel comfortable that you are absolutely in the right place for a presentation this evening about Saul Bloom, a congressman who lived in our neighborhood, our Bloomingdale neighborhood, for a number of years and served us as a congressman for a very long period. So again, welcome to on behalf of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. You're in the right place for the Saul Bloom presentation.
All right, we are live on YouTube, so this will be up by tomorrow morning.
Okay, again, you're in the right place if you're signing in to see the Saul Bloom presentation that's being done by the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. In just a few minutes, we'll officially begin with Pam Tice, one of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group members, who will do a brief introduction and tell you a little bit about the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group, and then we'll get underway with the full-fledged presentation. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's been awfully cold outside, and this will be hopefully an entertaining way to spend an hour or so learning about some history in our Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. So thank you for zooming in, and welcome again on behalf of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. Again, welcome on behalf of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group for zooming in on the presentation this evening about Saul Bloom, our long-serving congressman who lived in the neighborhood. And we'll begin in just a few minutes with one of our Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group members, Pam Tice, who will introduce tonight's topic and also tell you a little bit about the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. And I think we all know it's going to get awfully cold tonight. So this is hopefully an enjoyable way to learn some local history as you contemplate the very idea that when you wake up in the morning, it might be as low as 19 degrees. In another minute or two, and we'll begin tonight's presentation. Thank you so much for tuning in on behalf of our Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. If we had wanted to play some music now that would go along with the Saul Bloom presentation, there would be plenty of it as you'll learn about Saul Bloom. He was very much involved.
He sounds like quite the character, Jim. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, I'm gonna resist the temptation to not sing too many of the songs he was associated with and involved with, but we have a lot of entertainment in our Bloomingdale neighborhood for sure, not only today, but through all of our illustrious history. So, but Pam, this might be a good point for you to tell us a little bit about the Bloomingdale neighborhood.
Okay, sure. Okay, I'm happy to welcome everybody tonight to our January program for the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. If you're new to us, we're a group that's been around for about 20 years, all interested in our local history, particularly our Bloomingdale neighborhood, which covers approximately 86th to 110th Street, the park to the river. And you can find out a lot about us on our website, upperwestsidehistory.org, where you'll see our work in discovering and sharing our local history as we do with Zoom presentations like tonight, newsletters, blog posts. We have a collection at the Bloomingdale Library. We do local tours, and we have a very useful building database that might be of interest to you if you're doing some work on looking at the history of your own building. Our next event is a walking tour of the neighborhood with this famous Jim Mackin, who's also tonight's presenter. And that will be on Sunday, February 27th at 2 p.m., meeting on the south end of Strauss Park at Broadway and 106th Street. If you've been with us before, you may remember Jim Mackin, who's brought us many programs, from local movie making to the building of the 9th Avenue L. Jim is the author of Notable New Yorkers of Manhattan's Upper West Side, covering a multitude of our accomplished neighbors. Jim is also a terrific New York City guide and founder of Weekday Walks, which offers tours on Wednesday mornings. Tonight's talk is drawn from Jim's book covering the career of Saul Bloom, who served for 28 years in Congress, representing our neighborhood. Jim will share the details of Congressman Bloom's career from the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago to the creation of the United Nations. So Jim, looking forward to hearing more about this famous congressman.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Pam. And those of you that haven't had the wonderful opportunity yet of reading some of Pam's blogs on our upperwestsidehistory.org site, as well as you might even recognize some of Pam's articles in the West Side Rag on behalf of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. There's some incredible history that is very original and you will find nowhere else. So here's my book, in case you haven't seen this, widely available at Book Culture, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, New York Historical Society gift shop, Columbia University's gift shop, et cetera, et cetera. 591 people in our neighborhood, and there are more that we're in the process of putting on our website, the upperwestsidehistory.org website. But for the moment, this book will whet your appetite with 591 notable people. You might recognize some of the people on the cover. But let's move on to this evening's presentation, Saul Bloom. I first came upon Saul Bloom just a few years back when I was researching Strauss Park. We had people from the Strauss Family Historical Society do a presentation, and we supplemented it with even more detail, but a lot of wonderful history about the Strauss family. And what I tried to do was make a connection from Isidor Strauss. He's one of the 2 of 3 famous brothers that ran Macy's department store, but he was also a short-term congressman. I tried to make a connection from him all the way up to our current congressman, Gerald Nadler. And it was not an easy thing to do. There was a change in redistricting rather frequently, and the congressional district number even changed from 15 to 18 to 19 to 20. It was a bit complicated. Towards the end of this evening's presentation, I'll show you my simplified version of it. But anyhow, that got me really, really interested in Bloom. And I found out that Saul Bloom was much more than just a long-term congressman. He did serve from 1922 to 1949. Fascinating guy, as you'll see. He had no formal education, but he rose to become chairman of the Congressional Committee on Foreign Affairs in Congress. And you can imagine how important that was during the period of World War II. He was part of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's inner circle. So here's an image just to underscore what I just said. FDR is getting together a bunch of delegates that are going to head out to San Francisco, which is where Bloom began his professional career, and they're going to create the United Nations. On April 25th, 1945, delegates from 51 member nations met in San Francisco, and Bloom was one of them. Another member that was there is also in my book, legendary Barnard Dean Virginia Gildersleeve, on behalf of American Women's Education. She was part of forming the United Nations also. But let's start at the beginning with Saul Bloom. His parents came from Poland. They settled in Peoria, Illinois. Sometime before 1860, they operated a small clothing store. Saul Bloom was born in a city a little bit south of Peoria called Pekin, Illinois. But the financial panic of 1873 took its toll, and the Bloom family, with 5 of 6 of the children, went out to San Francisco. Bloom, from the beginning, was very, 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 very entrepreneurial. Here's a picture of him as a young, dapper guy, but I can tell you, he started making money, if I could put it so mundanely, when he was like 5 or 6 years old. One day he was standing in front of a theater and a gentleman came out and asked him if he wanted to make 4 bits. So his professional career in entertainment began right then and there. And the gentleman who gave him his opportunity was this fellow, David Belasco. And you probably recognize the Belasco Theater image on the right side. That's the Belasco Theater here in the Times Square area. But there's also a Belasco Theater in San Francisco and Los Angeles, and even in some other other cities. The whole Belasco family were very renowned theater and impresario people. Belasco would become a Broadway legend, but he's probably best remembered for putting Madame Butterfly on the stage, which in short order, Puccini would turn into a very popular opera. Bloom's first job was a child actor on the stage, but he soon worked and learned all the facets of theater business, include from ushering to ticket sales. At age 15, he connected with a fellow named Mike DeYoung, whose politically powerful family founded and ran the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper. That's DeYoung in the middle with the newspaper. And some of you might even recognize the DeYoung Fine Arts Museum on the upper left side before it got modernized on the lower right side. It's been in the news quite a bit in the last year, even with some of the exhibitions they've been having through the COVID period. So DeYoung was opening a new theater called the Alcazar in San Francisco. There is an Alcazar today in San Francisco, but it's actually the 4th one. The original one, which I'll show here, was destroyed by the earthquake of 1906. Bloom was hired as an assistant there at $50 a week. Numerous notables performed at this Alcazar, including at least one other that's also in my notables book, and that's Ned Harrigan of Harrigan and Hart. You all know the song H-A-R-R-I-G, you know, the George M. Cohen song. That's our own Ned Harrigan, who lived at 245 West 102nd Street. In addition, the Alcazar Theater, this one that we see here, was equipped with a gymnasium above the theater. Bloom staged boxing matches there. That was his entrepreneurial spirit. And he took up boxing himself. And his boxing instructor was this fellow, James J. Corbett, Gentleman Jim. Gentleman Jim Corbett would be labeled Gentleman Jim because of his personality. He was a real decent guy. He became the world champion just a few years later in 1892 down in New Orleans. He lived in Bayside out in Queens, part of New York City for many years. And some of you may be familiar with the 1942 movie called Gentleman Jim, starring Errol Flynn as Jim Corbett. But back to Bloom. Before he was 18 years old, he was making $15,000 to $20,000 a year. And you know what those dollars would be in that time period. And of course, there was no income tax. He saved about $25,000. And as a wealthy teenager, he went to France. And he wanted to see the fair there. So here's the fair in France that he was visiting. This is called the Exposition Universelle, and it introduced the world to the Eiffel Tower and many other things. Bloom, who's there, and he's only 18 or 19 years old, gets fascinated with dancers and acrobats that were part of something called the Algerian village. You know, France had a kind of colonial connection with Algeria until Algeria became a separate country later on. And Bloom actually engaged the Algerian village troupe to come to Chicago. But it took a few years. And why Chicago? Well, Bloom decided he wanted to be more entrepreneurial, and San Francisco had its limits. So he decided to get a job at the Chicago 1939 World's Fair. And as we know, the 1893 Chicago World's Fair was incredibly important and significant. It really changed the face of how America looked at itself, had sweeping implications with architecture, with cities' beautiful movement, with urban planning. It goes on and on and on and on. And Bloom, at that young age, was put in charge of the commercial side of it with amusements. And in fact, this is the first World's Fair that actually had amusements per se. He created the Midway Plaisance, which was a mile-long thoroughfare of different amusements, lots of ethnic-type villages, musical talents. Scott Joplin performed there, John Philip Sousa. We go on and on. We got to resist the temptation to go off our path here. But the Ferris wheel is another thing that was a part of all that. Bloom reported directly to the head of the whole fair, Daniel Burnham. You may know him from the New York City Flatiron Building or Union Station down in Washington, and so much great architecture in Chicago, obviously. Even the first moving walkway was at the fair. The first movie theater, Edward Joybridge did some of the first movie theater, first movies that were shown for the public, charging fees. This is the fair that also brought us the first time they used the Pledge of Allegiance in public. Things like Quaker Oats, shredded wheat, Cracker Jacks, the list just goes on and on and on. But that was Bloom's responsibility. In his Midway, and even the word Midway began at the fair here, so we can give Bloom even credit for that. In the fair here, one of the high attractions was Little Egypt. This was a woman, there's an image of her on the left, who performed belly dancing. Over on the right, there's the figure of an Algerian troupe dancer who was part of the Algerian entertainment at the fair. Little Egypt introduced America to that suggestive version of the belly dance known as the hoochie coochie. It was created, the dance was done to a tune that Bloom created, believe it or not. He never copyrighted it. 2 years later, it became a national hit by someone else, another noted Tin Pan Alley artist, composer called Jim Thornton. But Bloom created the melody that I remember as a kid went like this. Oh, the girls in France do the hula hula dance. That little riff, and to words that Bloom created for the fair went like this. Some of the lyrics, oh, they don't wear pants on the sunny side of France. There's a place in France where the women wear no pants. This was such an attraction at the fair. But I want to convince you of a further thought, which is the hoochie coochie weaves its way through all of American culture in a number of respects. The upper left-hand corner here is the great Cab Calloway, who was a long-term feature at the Cotton Club before Duke Ellington came along. And Cab Calloway sang his signature song about Minnie the Moocher. She was a real low-down hoochie coocher. Or on the right side, when Presley first shook his hips on the Steve Allen show and later the Sullivan show and whatnot, some of the commentary wrote about he was doing like a hoochie coochie dance. And then curiously enough, he does a movie a few years later called The Roustabout, and he actually sings a song called Little Egypt. And there's an image here with the Little Egypt. Or to not even belabor the point too much, on the lower left-hand side, we have Steve Martin, big hit on the charts in the 1980s with King Tut. If you listen to King Tut, the opening melody is that one that Bloom crafted. So this is the significance of the hoochie coochie. There's much, much more. The Muddy Waters had a standard song called I'm Your Hoochie Coochie Man. et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I won't belabor the point anymore, but after the fair, Bloom went bankrupt. He must have put too much money into getting the Algerian troupe to come over to the United States and putting them up and whatnot. But the Pullman strike of 1894, which is almost the basis for a modern and official Labor Day, the Pullman strike, which is a whole story unto itself, stopped a lot of the traffic for goods coming in and out of Chicago. So that impacted Bloom. He decided to start a whole new career, and he was going to become the Chicago representative of one of the largest music publishing companies, M. Whitmark and Sons. So Bloom did that, became very successful, and even published some of his own music. I'll show you just, none of these names will be familiar to us, but they all have the name Saul Bloom on the bottom of the sheet music. He worked with all the greats. One fellow he worked with a lot was Leo Friedman, who's one of his big songs is "Let Me Call You Sweetheart, I'm in love with you." But when Bloom got married, his wife was a song composer. His wife, whose name was Evelyn Heschmeyer, he published some of her stuff, and at their wedding, some of the illustrious song publishers that were there were Charles K. Harris, who wrote "After the Ball Is Over." Even Paul Dresser was there. Paul Dresser was the brother of Theodore Dreiser. We know American Tragedy. But Paul Dresser, who's in the Notables book as well, living on 203 West 106th Street, Paul Dresser wrote composed the state song of Indiana, "On the Banks of the Wabash." So these are the people that Bloom knew directly and worked with commercially directly. But in 1903, Bloom moved to New York City to try to expand his national chain of sheet music and music into music departments in department stores. So where does he get involved with? He gets involved with a store that was prominent in Chicago at the time. The large building there is the Cooper Siegel store. And curiously enough, on the upper right hand, they had a huge fountain inside of it. And the sculpture in it is a 18-foot replica of the one that was the center of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Henry Cooper, who knew Bloom, hired him to deal with the Macy's situation. The Cooper Siegel store here was on 6th Avenue at 18th Street, part of what we even today call the Old Ladies Mile. That's actually the 6th Avenue L running adjacent to it. But Macy's had moved from their location on 14th Street and 6th Avenue up to 34th Street, as we know. Henry Siegel was concerned that he would lose competition big time to Macy's. So he engaged Saul Bloom to help negotiate for some space configurations up on 34th Street. And to make a long story short, they didn't work out, but a piece of property that Cooper Siegel had is the corner of Macy's there that never got built. Some of us may remember in recent times, Nedick's was there. So it's a complicated story. One of the Bloomingdale neighborhood presenters that we had a few months back, the great Andrew Halpern, who's done books on the Dakota and much, much else with New York City architecture, did 2 fabulous books on holdouts, and they recount the story in great detail. But Bloom also got involved with a lot of real estate up in the Bronx and Upper Manhattan. But when he came to New York, this is where he lived at first. He lived in the Ansonia, which was just built, I think, I forget the exact date, 1904 and 1906. So here's an image of it before some stuff got built around it. Bloom in 1908 opened a store on the corner of 35th and 5th Avenue to sell RCA's new invention, the Victrola. Very successful. Here's a Times article that shows that Bloom was the principal salesman for that. But where did he make much, much more money? He dabbled in real estate. And as I just had mentioned, he did real estate in the Bronx, Upper Manhattan, various places, a lot around the Times Square area. So his money, his redesign, and occasionally his construction efforts went into building these theaters. And these, as you can see, are very, very notable theaters, all have underpinnings from Saul Bloom. Some of these are with us, like the Apollo and the Music Box, which I've always associated with Irving Berlin. A lot of his stuff got premiered there because he and the fellow Sam Harris owned it. So, but let's get to the rest of Saul's life. If you ever wander up to 115th Street and Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard, you can see a picture of me on the left side there. I'm at that site. There's a little triangle that's created by St. Nicholas Avenue and Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard and 115th Street. It's officially a city park. It may be the smallest park in the city. I don't know for sure. Someone could check that out. But it's called the Samuel Marks Triangle. It honors a community leader and prominent auctioneer, Samuel Marks. He lived, as you can see, from 1867 to 1922. He was elected to Congress by barely beating out a 7-term congressman by the name of Walter M. Chandler. But Marks died of a heart disease before he could even begin his term. So Governor Miller at the time, some of us may even remember the old Miller Highway, the elevated West Side Highway down in the teens and 20s and whatnot. Governor Miller called a special election to fill the congressional seat. Bloom lived in the district, which ran approximately 86 to 125th Street on the Upper West Side. And the boss of New York City, Tammany Hall at the time, Charlie Murphy, asked Bloom to run against Chandler. Bloom, let me mention, 34,000 people voted. It was a hotly contested congressional seat, and Bloom won by 145 votes. So that was contested, et cetera, but Bloom prevailed. After he won the election, they actually celebrated at an old restaurant that Pam Tice might know something about, called Pommy's or Pomerantz's on the corner of 95th and Broadway. I think they went out of business during the Depression, but one of the great Upper West Side restaurants. But there's a little bit of backstory to this. They anticipated in 1922, when they had the special election, that there might be a 3-way race for the presidency. And indeed, that's what actually happened. In 1924, there was a 3-way race between Calvin Coolidge, John W. Davis. Davis is the namesake of the law firm Davis Polk Wardwell, and Robert M. La Follette, who was a past governor of Wisconsin. La Follette ran on a third party line. And here's the essence of the backstory. Because there might not be enough electoral college votes for any one of these 3 people to get officially elected president, meaning getting a majority of the electoral college votes, the count would revert to the House of Representatives. And that's why it was important for Saul Bloom as a Democrat to win over Chandler, who was a Republican. It was considered absolutely key to this interesting possibility. Here's a picture of Walter M. Chandler, and in the middle, of course, Saul Bloom again. And when Bloom eventually died in office in 1949, he was followed by another third-party candidate, Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr. And that's a whole fascinating story unto itself. So in 19, here's a picture of Bloom with some of his new congressman friends standing on the steps of the Capitol, you could see. I show you this picture of Bloom with Calvin Coolidge. Coolidge, of course, succeeded Warren G. Harding. Harding actually appointed Bloom to the Committee on Foreign Affairs. Harding's mistress, Nan Britton, is in my notables book, if that interests you. She lived in our neighborhood for a short while. But you could see that Bloom has some amount of growing prominence in Congress. His wife and daughter, here's his daughter Vera Bloom. His wife Evelyn and his daughter Vera Bloom and Saul were great socializers. They entertained constantly, and they entertained not only Washington types in Congress and administration and whatnot, but a lot of foreign dignitaries. In fact, the daughter Vera Bloom, one time they traveled to Italy in 1924, and she established a relationship with Mussolini, which kind of haunted her for a little while after that, when got closer to World War II time and whatnot. But that's the type of thing they did. They met all the kings and queens of European countries and England and all of that stuff. Vera was renowned in her own right. She published 2 books. One is called There's No Place Like Washington, where she talks about a lot of interesting connections that they had. And a second book, The Entertaining Lady, kind of the same thing, but it was subtitled An Informal Guide to Good Living, and it had to do with etiquette and just how to entertain dignitaries. And curiously enough, she wrote the words on the upper left side. You'll see she's the lyricist. You'll see that down in the middle, the lyricist of a song called Jealousy, or sometimes it's called Jealousy. Easily one of the top 5 recognizable tangos. And the tango itself was written by a Danish composer, Jacob Gade, in 1924. A few years later, she added the words, and then it got recorded by a number of people, but in the early 50s, Frankie Lane, his version of it, his recording of it, really hit the national charts big time. Now, having said that, I'll give you a little bit of full disclosure. There's some little bit of controversy about her with this. There's a woman from England named Winifred Emma May, who wrote poems under the pen name Patience Strong. And some people maintain that under the pen name Vera Bloom, she penned the words to Jealousy. I just don't see enough substantial data to verify that. So here's an image of Saul Bloom and Ulysses S. Grant III. And the 2 of them were appointed chairman of the George Washington Bicentennial. In 1932, they wanted to celebrate the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birth. Nothing major came out of it because of the Depression mostly. In fact, Saul Bloom wanted to have a little fair on the Bryant Park site, and there just wasn't enough momentum to kind of get that going. But I'd like to think that the spirit of this carried on. In 1936, here's an image of Walter Johnson, the great Hall of Fame baseball pitcher, throwing, and I'm missing an R in throws, I could say, throwing a silver bottle of $1 across the Rappahannock River. And this was commemorating some more attention to George Washington, because the 1939 40 World's Fair was supposed to be the 200th anniversary of Washington taking the oath of office. In fact, if you look beyond the futuristic stuff in the 39-40 World's Fair, the Perisphere and some of that modern imagery. In fact, it was the first World's Fair that looked to the future. You'll see there was a huge statue of George Washington, and ostensibly the fair was about celebrating Washington's 200th anniversary of Washington taking the oath of office. But anyhow, Saul Bloom lost a bet. He thought that Walter Johnson couldn't throw a silver dollar. In fact, Saul Bloom donated the silver dollar, a 1796 silver dollar, which Walter Johnson threw across the Rappahannock River, 372 feet wide. And that was quite an event in his day. Well, we have the onset of World War II. Bloom was an ardent Zionist. Even back in 1926, he gave Henry Ford a hard time when Ford made a statement that international Jews were in control of the financial center, et cetera, et cetera. So some of that kind of just, passed through the news and whatnot. But, Bloom made his point and Ford kind of backpedaled out of that and whatnot. But here's an image where right after Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese, America was taken by surprise. FDR called a number of key people together, including a bunch of people you see in this image. And the larger group included the Vice President Henry Wallace, most cabinet members, including Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, even General George Marshall, who would go on to have a much larger role, Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn, House Majority Leader John McCormick, other key members of Congress, and of course, as you could see on the upper left-hand side here, Saul Bloom. And right after that, the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor. So I give you this to show the lineage in Congress from Isidore Straus, who lived in our neighborhood. These are all Congress people coming right up to Congressman Nadler of today. I'm simplifying like crazy here because the congressional district got changed extensively, but you could see Straus, you could see a fellow Joseph Rowan, and I've given you the addresses here where they were: Saul Bloom, then our Franklin D. Roosevelt, who lived on Broadway in the 80s, James Scheuer lived on 110th Street, William Fitzryan, who many of us remember living on Riverside Drive, Ted Weiss, who I remember even seeing on the 104 bus, living at West End Avenue, and today Congressman Jerry Nadler, who served 30 years, so he beats the record of Saul Bloom by 2 years. Here's Saul Bloom's addresses when he lived in New York City. I've put on the left side here his addresses in different parts of the country. But you could see in Manhattan, he lived in some interesting places, first in the Ansonia, then on Central Park West for a while, and even further up Riverside Drive, 645 West End Avenue, where he spent a lot of time, and then 2 other places. The 91st Street address is interesting for the following reason. There's the Saul Bloom Playground. In fact, to the left of this in the image is a public school that used to be the Saul Bloom School. But in 1994, they decided to change the name of it. That's okay because the Saul Bloom Playground is still there. They use some of the imagery associated with the Bloomingdale name, which kind of covered our neighborhood for years and years and years. The blooming flowers there, obviously, even below the fountain below. I don't show it here, but behind the scenes a little bit is some stuff from the, believe it or not, The Wizard of Oz. But this got renamed in 1994 for a woman named Lillian Weber. She was very actively involved in education at City College. So, but the Bloom name is still respectfully noted here. So if you ever have a chance walking down 91st and 92nd Street, take a look at this. It's just east of Columbus Avenue. One last thing I'll show you here is the official portrait of Saul Bloom, done by the great Chandler Christie, great artist of that period. It's in the collection of the U.S. House of Representatives. As I mentioned just quickly in passing, he died in 1949 when he was living in the master's apartment building at 310 Riverside Drive. We miss him dearly, and I hope he gets more appreciation. And I hope you enjoyed this evening's presentation. Thank you very much. And let's remember Saul Bloom.
Thank you, Jim. Now, if you have any questions about the presentation, I can read it off the chat as we go along. Or if anyone wants to raise their hand and say something, they can go ahead. All right, so we have one hand raised. I'm going to see who that is. Okay.
And by the way, this is Michael Gonzalez, one of the esteemed members of our Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. Michael facilitates a lot of things that we do, and Pam Tice, who introduced me, will be on hand also, and we can help with any curiosities you might have about Saul Bloom. And we'll have presentations coming up. We've got some wonderful stuff planned coming up in the next few months.
Okay, we have one hand raised from Peter and one from Victoria. So we're going to go with Peter first and see.
Hi, Jim and Michael and Pam. Thank you very much for tonight. Had a question about the Masters. So he was living at the Masters, but I thought that the Masters was primarily for artists and their studios. Am I way off on that?
No, not at all. It started that way, and my limited understanding is there was some combination of it just branched out, and they had a little bit of internal conflict. The largest conflict of which was with I'm having a senior moment here. The fellow who moved to the mansion, the townhouse that was later occupied by the lyricist. I'm forgetting his name too, but Pam, any chance you remember?
Was it Rorich?
Yeah, Nicholas Rourke. Nicholas Rourke was originally in the master's apartment building and had a falling out with their management. I think they were mostly self-managed.
Yeah.
And and
But-
Rourke.
Yeah, but Saul Bloom was an artist. I mean, he did artistic things before he went to Congress. So
Okay,
maybe that
thank you,
qualified
Pam.
him.
Yeah, maybe that's what got him in there. I don't know. Yeah. I hope we learn more about Saul Bloom. You know, right now the primary source is his autobiography, and he's a showman. So he talks or writes mostly about, you know, the things that he made happen in a grandiose basis. But I think there's much more to him, like his congressional life, which doesn't get talked about enough. Did you
Well,
have
thank
another
you.
question? Okay.
All right, next up is Victoria Rosen. You should be able to talk now.
Hi, Victoria.
Maybe.
Victoria, we're waiting maybe for you to talk.
Hello?
Hello?
Yes.
We can hear you, Victoria.
What?
Oh, did you have a question or did? Okay, so we're gonna go with another comment. Someone mentioned that they were actually named after Saul Bloom because they had grown up across the street from Saul Bloom School and Park.
Say that
And
again, Michael.
oh, so someone in the comments, someone in the audience was named after Saul Bloom. They had lived across they were raised across the street from the Saul Bloom and Park.
Wow. Oh, it's fascinating. Wow. Yeah.
And someone mentioned that the Wikipedia article on Saul Bloom says that Bloom was invited to run, but he won the usually Republican Silk Stocking district of Manhattan's Upper West Side by 145 votes. They're wondering if that should be revised, or is the old district include both sides of the Central Park?
It was mostly the west side. I don't think he had anything to do with the so-called Silk Stock district. He was a Republican early in his life, I know, but as soon as he came to New York in 1908 or so, he kind of got the lay of 1903, got the lay of the land, and he realized New York City was more of a Democratic place. So he got right involved with Democratic politics.
And for those of you watching tonight's talk will be recorded and placed on the Upper West Side History Group website, which I'll put in the link in a second. Should be available tomorrow morning.
His wife died. I'm just brainstorming random things that maybe I haven't touched upon. His wife died in 1941. She was a great socializer in Washington, D.C. And fortunately, and they lived in a couple of prominent places in Washington, D.C. So some addresses, we won't go off on a tangent here, but they were really in the center of Washington society during the 30s when FDR and the Democratic Party kind of reigned supreme, but the Republicans and the Democrats socialized together. And he was very socially involved with all the prominent players there. And his daughter, who never married, his daughter died in 1959. She was somewhat prominent. She knew a lot of important people, got around the social scene in Washington. And after Saul Bloom's wife died, the daughter was a great assistance to him whenever he needed a woman to assist him in socializing, which he did a fair amount of. Saul Bloom didn't go to high school, certainly didn't go to college, but boy, was he smart. More than street smarts, he knew how to build businesses, make people connections. Obviously got to know things like architecture and development, and I mean, he was just an incredible dynamo of a fella. I hope he doesn't get forgotten in history.
Someone wanted to know what was the third party in the 1924 election, if you know.
I don't know the name of the party, but Robert M. La Follette was the governor of Wisconsin for a while. And Wisconsin was very, very progressive, left-leaning in its day. Today, there's almost a dichotomy there. There's like a strong conservative kind of side to it, and then there's also still a strong liberal side. But in its day, it was very progressive and whatnot. So it wasn't all that surprising that La Follette, was a contender in the 24 election. But the election wasn't close. When it finally did happen, Coolidge won by a landslide. The 20s were really the era of the Republicans, because it grew up to the high point in the stock market until it crashed in 1929. So.
Okay, and someone wanted to know if he ever remarried after.
He did not. Yeah, when he died in 1949, it was unexpected, but he was very elderly. Remember, he was born in 1870, so he bridges again the Chicago World's Fair. He bridges that with World War II. He saw a lot happen in his lifetime. He knew so many presidents, notable people. But we lost him in 1949. The story after he died was interesting because Roosevelt couldn't get on the Democratic slate, let alone he wouldn't get on the Republican slate. If anything, he was a Democrat liberal, but he had to go third party to even run, which he did, and then he got elected as a third party candidate. So that's got a whole fascinating aspect to it. And Saul Bloom had to be a real tough act to follow.
Someone answered and said it was the Progressive Party. Third one. Yeah.
Well, someone may want to check me on that. I'm not sure that was the official title, but Progressive, I think, was probably close to the spirit of whatever the party was called at the time. And, the Roaring 20s was when, things were going real well and the market was going up and whatnot. So progressive types were kind of in the minority.
All right. Anyone have any other questions? Let's see.
Saul Bloom, I think, is worthy of more history. Right now, other than doing independent research with newspapers and whatnot, the primary source on Saul Bloom is his autobiography. And it's a pretty decent autobiography, but it's really important that other historians, one comes to mind, David Nassau, who's a wonderful historian in our neighborhood, living on 101st Street. He would have a field day with writing up a real good history of Saul Bloom. So a good history of Saul Bloom is awaited. I hope from what I've covered tonight, you see all the fascinating aspects of his life. And I think the reason why much hasn't been written about him is because he didn't have any descendants. He only had, one child, the daughter, and she passed away in 1959, and then he kind of got forgotten. And, and that period kind of took us through the Depression. And then after that, and we all know the Upper West Side had some tough times, even well into the 70s and 80s. But finally, when the Upper West Side really comes to life financially and intellectually, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then we start to know our Congress people, and we know the politicians that kind of come out of this area. But unfortunately, Saul Bloom's time period wasn't exactly aligned with all those positive forces. So I hope we're going to see more of the Saul Bloom life and maybe more writings and other history about him in the future.
Okay, we might have one other hand up. Let's see if this is Stefan or Stefan.
Oh, Steve Mayo. Hi, Steve. Can you hear us?
I got it. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, Jim, that was terrific. It was very entertaining. I had no idea about him, so he was really fascinating. Was there any legislating that he's done that helped the neighborhood? Is he famous for anything like that?
Nothing specific that I know, because of his, his committee responsibilities. He had mostly to do with, and I'm looking at my notes to see what his title was, what the committee title was, but it was also a tough period in United States history. There wasn't much money floating around, but he was pretty decent with getting some of the money from the 1930s with social legislation coming into the neighborhood. I can't give you any specifics, but he was pretty in tune to that. He was very well liked in the neighborhood. I think after seven terms of a Republican representative, Chandler, and Chandler was not only Republican, but he was born in Mississippi and kind of worked his way up to New York. And then when Saul Bloom came after that, it was like a congressional district that became more and more and more Democratic. So Bloom really didn't have much competition as the years went by. But again, let's remember this was during the Depression, and this was during the time that FDR was president for 4 terms. So yeah, I'd love to explore more about Saul Bloom with the specifics of legislation. But he was a dynamo. He was a force to be reckoned with in Congress. And in those days, you probably had to work with him as opposed to working against him. As soon as World War II broke out, everybody on all sides of the aisle, rallied to, win the war, and Bloom was right there with everyone else. But I think it says something that he was involved with the creation of the United Nations. So,
Yeah.
We have another hand up from Lynn Bender, from Lynn Max. Let's see.
hi, Lynn, you can hear us. We can't hear you yet.
I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. Okay. I just wanted to remind everybody, okay, thank you, Barry, for a great presentation. But Bella Abzug, another force to be reckoned with, also represented our neighborhood. And my husband, Steve Max, and I really know this because 50 years ago, we met when she was the campaign manager for Bella Abzug's campaign in 1972. And I was the volunteer, and that's where we met.
Oh, that's fabulous. And in fact, I remember when her district kind of came up to our neighborhood, and I was saying to myself, gee, of all the congressional districts in the whole country, doesn't it make sense to like marry Greenwich Village, let's say, with the Upper West Side? And,
Right.
and not only did it happen that way, but we got Bella to rightfully represent a lot of it. And today, New York State has lost congressional districts as other states, Texas and California, it got more population, obviously. But our current congressional district with Congressman Nadler extends well into Brooklyn, as many of us know. And I think that covers a lot of, liberal areas of Brooklyn, all the way down to, all the way through like Brooklyn Heights, down into the Orthodox Jewish section in central Brooklyn. But it also connects with all of us on the west side of Manhattan, all the way up through our neighborhood and further up. And that's it kind of self-corrected, if I could put it that way.
Steve Max here. The idea was to get rid of one of the 2 main anti-Vietnam War members of Congress. So Bella was redistricted in with Ryan so that they would do themselves in.
Wow. And it's interesting too with Congressman Ryan. He's a Southern guy, certainly with strong Democratic liberal sympathies, as he's demonstrated over and over again. But he came from Virginia and then winds up in New York. So it's curious that Chandler came from, I think, Mississippi all the way up to New York. Saul Bloom comes from Illinois vis-a-vis California to New York. William Fitzryan came from Virginia up to New York. That's one of the wonderful things about New York, Manhattan in particular. These people come from all over the place and then adapt our very unique kind of politics here, which is incredibly dynamic and forward thinking. This is the place to do that. Any other questions, Michael?
Someone wanted to know what the motivation was for Saul Bloom to run in the first place.
That's an interesting question. He by 1922, he was very much connected with the Democratic Party machine. He knew all the bigwigs in the party. A lot of it had to do with his real estate operations. People like him and some other names I could mention were kind of on the forefront of real estate, meaning the growing north in Manhattan and into the Bronx. As the Bronx got more and more populated, it got subsumed in a simple sense by some of the congressional districts in Manhattan. And with that thought in mind, he was prominent enough in the party. And then along comes Marx. And Samuel Marx gets elected. He was a force in city politics, but he hadn't yet run for Congress. So he runs for Congress and he beats Chandler. And everybody thought this would be the turn of events that would have Democratic representation on the Upper West Side. But Marx died prematurely. In fact, I showed that image there up on 115th Street. If you ever walk up Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard, the old 7th Avenue up 115th Street, you'll see that name Marx, and it might just remind you that he would have been our congressman had he not died. So anyhow, then they have to have the special election. And Bloom rises to the occasion. I don't know a lot of details around that, but Bloom was prominent enough to be party to that election that happened, and he wound up beating Chandler. And again, as I tried to point out melodramatically, by 145 votes. The voting was very contested, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Bloom survived, and then became a force down in Washington, D.C.
And again, do you know what the boundaries of his district were when he was elected?
Approximately 86th Street to 125th Street on the west side. Those boundaries kept changing quite a bit. In fact, that there was a lot of fascinating history later on when Bella Abzug and William Fitzryan are elected and whatnot, but in that period, and they changed quite frequently. And they changed in some part because population was growing. The city kept moving north in terms of population density. But when he got elected, it was roughly West 86th Street up to West 125th Street.
Thank you. It seems like that was it for the last bit of questions.
Okay. I hope we learn more about Saul Bloom, and I hope someone takes it upon themselves to write a definitive biography. I hope he doesn't get kind of lost to history because he's way too significant, and especially for our neighborhood. That's my hope. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Jim.
Michael, for
You
making
made it
this
a lot.
happen. Sam,
Thank you, Jim.
thank you.
Okay.
Take care now. Be well, everyone.